Chris bought a duplex. Ethan bought basically nothing. At least that's what everyone thought. One had tenants, rent checks, and something he could physically touch. The other had a boring app with numbers going up and down. Fast forward 15 years, one of them quietly walked away with more money, less stress, and 0 midnight phone calls. The other? Let's just say the passive income dream didn't exactly go how Instagram sells it. And here's the crazy part. Most people watching this will pick the wrong one. Not because they're dumb, but because nobody ever shows you the full math. And once you actually see the numbers, it completely flips what you think you know. All right, before we go any further, let's slow this whole thing down for a second and actually make this comparison fair, because if we don't do that, none of this really means anything. Chris and Ethan are not special cases, they're not lucky, and they're definitely not starting ahead of everyone else. They're basically in the exact same position in life, living in the same city, earning around $60,000 a year, and slowly building up their savings over time. There's no inheritance, no shortcuts, no sudden lucky break, just years of showing up to work, saving money consistently, and doing what most people say they're going to do but never actually stick with. Eventually, they both reach that moment that almost everyone hits at some point, where they're staring at their savings and realizing that the next decision they make is probably going to matter more than anything they've done so far. And this is where things start to split, because Chris looks at that money and sees opportunity in property, something real, something physical, something he can control. So he decides to go all in on real estate without hesitation. Ethan, on the other hand, looks at the same money and makes a much quieter decision, putting it into index funds, setting up a simple automatic contribution, and then going right back to his normal life without overthinking it. Now, in the beginning, if you were watching both of them from the outside, it wouldn't even feel like a competition, because Chris's life suddenly looks way more impressive almost overnight. He's got a property now, real tenants living inside it, rent checks coming in every single month, and something he can physically point to and say, yeah, I own that. And socially, that matters more than people realize, because when Chris talks about real estate, people listen. They ask questions, they're curious, and it feels like he's doing something big. Meanwhile, Ethan's situation looks almost boring by comparison, because all he really has is a number on a screen that goes up a little, then down a little, and then up again. There's no keys in his pocket, no tenants calling him, no property he can drive past and admire. It's just numbers, and that doesn't feel like progress to most people. In fact, if you asked most people at this stage who's winning, almost everyone would point to Chris without even thinking twice. Because what Chris has is visible, it's tangible, it feels like success, and it fits perfectly into the picture that social media has painted about what building wealth is supposed to look like. But what nobody sees yet is what's happening underneath all of that, because the real story isn't in how things look in year 1 or 2, it's in what those decisions turn into over time. But somewhere between year 1 and year 3, something starts to shift. Not all at once, not in a dramatic way, but slowly, quietly. The story begins to change, and this is exactly where most people get caught off guard, because this is the part nobody really talks about. At the beginning, everything looked simple. A property, a tenant, money coming in every single month. It felt predictable. It felt stable. It felt like a system that just works. But then reality starts to show up. And it doesn't ask for permission, because that clean little number, that monthly profit Chris was excited about, starts getting chipped away, piece by piece, until it barely looks the same anymore. First, there are property taxes, and they don't care if your tenant pays on time, they don't care if something breaks, they show up every single year, no matter what. Then comes maintenance, and at first it feels small, almost harmless. A leaking faucet here, a minor repair there, nothing that seems like a big deal. But over time, those small problems turn into bigger ones, and those bigger ones turn into expenses that you can't ignore. One day it's a quick fix. The next day it's something that costs thousands, and it needs to be handled immediately. And then there's the one thing that almost nobody prepares for properly: vacancy. Because the moment that property sits empty, everything changes. The mortgage doesn't stop, the taxes don't stop, the insurance doesn't stop, but the income, that completely disappears. Now, instead of money coming in, you're covering everything out of your own pocket, hoping it gets filled again as quickly as possible. So what looked like steady profit in the beginning starts to feel a lot more unpredictable. Money is coming in, but almost just as quickly, money is going right back out. And for the first time, Chris starts realizing this isn't as passive as it sounded in the beginning. Meanwhile, on the other side, Ethan's life still looks exactly the same. Nothing flashy, nothing exciting, no big moments to talk about. He's still going to work, still living his normal routine, still checking his phone every now and then. But under the surface, something very different is happening. Because while Chris is dealing with problems, Ethan's numbers are quietly starting to build. No stress, no interruptions, no unexpected surprises. Just slow, consistent progress. And at this point in the story, you still wouldn't notice it. But this right here is where everything starts to separate. While all of this is happening, Ethan's experience looks completely different, almost to the point where it doesn't even feel like he's doing anything at all. He made his initial investment, set up automatic contributions every single month, and then just went right back to focusing on his job, his routine, and everything else going on in his life. There are no phone calls, no emergencies, no unexpected costs showing up out of nowhere, no moments where he has to suddenly stop everything and fix a problem. The only thing he really sees is his account balance slowly changing over time. And at first, it's not impressive. Some months it goes up a little, other months it drops, and during those drops, it definitely doesn't feel great. Because watching your money go down, even if you expect it, still messes with your head. But here's the difference. Ethan isn't relying on that money to survive day to day. He already made the decision that he's going to stick with the plan no matter what the market is doing in the short term. So instead of reacting, instead of panicking, instead of trying to time everything perfectly, he just lets it continue. And for a while, it honestly feels like nothing special is happening. Years go by, and it still looks kind of average. Nothing flashy, nothing exciting, nothing that makes people stop and say, wow, that's amazing. But then something starts to shift. Not suddenly, not overnight, but gradually, and then faster, and then noticeably faster. Because what most people don't realize is that the real power of this strategy isn't in the beginning, it's in what happens after enough time has passed. Because now it's not just his contributions growing, it's the returns on top of the returns, on top of the returns. And that's when things start to feel different. Now when he checks his account, the growth isn't small anymore. In some years, the gains alone are bigger than what he's putting in, without working more, without taking on more risk, without doing anything differently. And this is the part that almost nobody talks about early on, because it takes time to show up. While Chris has been actively solving problems, managing stress, and constantly putting out fires, Ethan's money has been quietly building momentum. And now that momentum is starting to take over. This is where compounding stops feeling boring and starts feeling powerful. And if you're not paying attention, this is the moment you completely miss. Because on the surface, it still doesn't look dramatic, but underneath, everything has changed. Then, somewhere around year 5, maybe closer to year 7, something starts to shift in a way that's very real, but also very easy to miss if you're not paying attention. Because on the surface, everything still looks pretty normal. Chris is still actively involved in his property, still solving problems, still getting those calls, still putting in time whenever something comes up. Some days are smooth, but other days still demand his attention. And over time, that starts to feel less like an investment and more like responsibility. Now, to be fair, his property has increased in value, and that's a good thing. On paper, he's building real wealth. But here's the catch. That growth isn't something he actually feels in his day-to-day life, because it's locked inside the asset. It's not something he can casually access, not something he sees every day, not something that changes how his daily life feels. So even though he's technically growing, it doesn't feel like momentum. It just feels slow. Now, on the other side, Ethan's situation starts to look different. At first, it's subtle, almost unnoticeable, but then he starts realizing something. His account isn't just growing steadily anymore, it's starting to pick up speed. And this is where things begin to feel different, because now it's not just his original money working for him, it's the growth on that money continuing to generate even more growth. And that cycle starts repeating over and over again without him doing anything extra, without more time, without more effort, without more stress. And that's the part that changes everything. Because while Chris is still trading time for managing his investment, Ethan's investment is starting to build on its own, quietly, in the background, every single day. And the key difference here isn't just the numbers, it's how that growth happens. Chris has to stay involved to keep things running, but Ethan, that process just continues whether he's paying attention or not. And this is the moment where compounding stops being theory and starts becoming real. But if you're not looking closely, you might miss it completely, because nothing about it feels dramatic, until one day it is. By the time they both reach the 10-year mark, the comparison becomes a lot more interesting than most people expect, because at this point, you would assume one of them is clearly ahead, that the gap would be obvious, easy to spot, easy to explain. But that's not what happens. Chris has built a significant amount of equity in his property. Over the years, he's been paying down the mortgage, slowly increasing ownership piece by piece. At the same time, the property itself has gone up in value. And when you combine those two things, what he owns and what it's worth, it's clear his investment has grown over time. On paper, it looks solid. Now, on the other side, Ethan's portfolio has also been growing, but in a very different way. It's been fueled by consistency, by those steady monthly contributions that kept going no matter what the market was doing, and more importantly, by years of compounding, quietly building on top of itself. At first, it didn't look like much, but over time, that growth started accelerating. And now, 10 years in, it's no longer small, it's real. And when you actually stop and put those numbers side by side, something surprising happens. They're closer than you'd expect, sometimes almost identical depending on the market and the property, which is not what most people would predict at the beginning of this story. Because in the beginning, Chris looked like he had the advantage. He had the asset, the leverage, the cash flow story. Ethan had a quiet account and a long-term plan. But now, a decade later, the outcome doesn't look so different. And once again, this is where most people focus only on the numbers. Who made more, who's ahead, who won. But the real difference isn't just in the numbers, it's in the path it took to get there. Chris had to stay involved the entire time. He had to manage the property, deal with problems, handle repairs, and navigate uncertainty year after year. Some years were smooth, but others required time, energy, and attention. Ethan's path looked completely different. He followed a system that required almost no ongoing effort. No emergencies, no late-night calls, no constant decisions. Just consistency, discipline, and time. And that difference doesn't show up in a simple number, but it shows up in everything else. In stress, in time, in freedom. And by year 10, that difference starts to matter a lot more than people expect. Now, fast forward another 10 years, and this is where the long-term impact of those decisions really becomes clear. Because at 20 years, you're no longer guessing, you're no longer estimating, you're looking at outcomes. Chris now owns a property that has appreciated significantly in value. Over time, the market moved, the neighborhood changed, and that asset grew. And depending on how everything played out, he may have it fully paid off or very close to it, which means that mortgage payment that used to show up every single month is either gone or almost gone. And now he's collecting rent that flows directly to him. And that income is real, it's tangible, it's visible, it's something he can actually use. And for a lot of people, that feeling matters a lot because it feels like the system is finally working. But here's the full picture that doesn't always get talked about. Over those 20 years, that outcome came with a long list of responsibilities.
unexpected costs, repairs that couldn't wait, periods of vacancy, and ongoing involvement that never fully disappeared. Even when things were going well, he still had to stay connected, still had to pay attention, still had to manage the moving parts. Now, on the other side, Ethan's situation looks very different, because while his approach didn't feel exciting at the beginning, time did most of the work for him. There were no big moments, no dramatic turning points, no sudden breakthroughs, just consistency over a long period of time. And his portfolio didn't just grow, it compounded on itself year after year. And eventually, that compounding reaches a point where the growth starts to feel disproportionate, not because he did more, but because time did more. And this is where things really start to shift. Because if Ethan increased his monthly investment even slightly at any point along the way, that change doesn't just add up, it multiplies. Through compounding, that extra money keeps working year after year on top of itself, which means a small decision made early can turn into a much larger difference later. And that's the part most people underestimate, because it doesn't look powerful in the beginning, but over 20 years, it changes everything.
At this point, it becomes clear that neither path is inherently better in every situation, even though people often argue as if one of them is the obvious winner. Because the truth is, both can work. Real estate can absolutely build wealth, but only if you're willing to treat it like a business, not a passive idea, not a side thought, but a real responsibility. That means dealing with tenants, repairs, market changes, and everything that comes with ownership. It's active, it demands attention, and it doesn't stop just because time passes. Stocks, on the other hand, operate differently. They reward a completely different mindset, one that doesn't rely on control but on patience, on consistency, and on the ability to stay calm when things move up and down without warning. Because volatility isn't a flaw in the system, it is the system. And the real challenge isn't the investment itself, it's the person making the decision. Because most people don't fail because they chose the wrong path. They fail because they never fully understood what their choice would actually require over time. They expect results without the discipline, growth without the patience, freedom without the process. And over time, that mismatch is what breaks everything. Not the market, not the property, not the strategy, but expectations. Because in the end, both paths demand something. One demands effort. The other demands patience. And the real question was never which one is better. It was always, what kind of person are you willing to become to stay in it long enough for it to work? So when people ask, which one is better, real estate or stocks, they're usually asking the wrong question. Because the real answer doesn't come from the investment itself. It comes from something deeper. It depends on what kind of life you want to build and what kind of effort you're willing to put in to get there. Because every path has a cost, not just financially, but in time, attention, and discipline. And the biggest mistake isn't choosing one over the other. It's making that decision based on hype, opinions, or surface-level information, without ever understanding what the full picture actually looks like. Because from the outside, everything looks simple, but over time, the reality becomes very different, and that's what most people miss. They focus on what looks easy instead of what actually lasts. And if you're thinking about combining both approaches, real estate and investing, that's where things start to become even more interesting. Because now you're not choosing one path, you're building balance. But that is a different level of thinking, and it requires a different level of understanding. So maybe the real takeaway isn't about picking sides. Maybe it's about learning how each system works before deciding how you fit into it. But that's a conversation for another time.